guys, welcome to 1.3 Collecting Sample Data, where we are going to differentiate between the various sampling methods and even talk about maybe some sampling error. Randomization. We want to use randomization because it's basically the gold standard in our in our experiments. And it's very effective. And one of the things like the Salk experiment here, they did random selection of the children. One group was given the polio vaccine by Jonas Salk. The other group was randomly given, they were given the placebo. And we noticed that the people that received the polio vaccine, there were less of them that got polio than the ones that did not get the vaccine. So they noticed that, hey, experiments that are random, you can get some decent results from that. And again, this example is basically an experiment. But it has randomized design. Because the subjects were given a treatment. And you can't always do an experiment. Sometimes there's like ethical reasons, there's cost, there's time. There's a lot of considerations that maybe allow you not to do an experiment. But if you can, it's usually better. So what if you can't? Well, then there's observational studies. An observational study is where we observe and measure specific characteristics, but we do not attempt to modify the subjects that are being studied. In an experiment, however, we apply some kind of treatment. And then we proceed to observe its effects on our subjects. And one of the things we need to note is our subjects in experiments are called experimental units. So while you're getting this down, we try to use an experiment because it's the gold standard, especially a randomized experiment. However, an observational study can be used, and that's where we just observe and measure the subjects, but we don't modify anything. However, in an experiment, we actually provide a treatment, and then we go and look and see what the effects of the treatment are on the subjects. So an example of, say, an observational study is maybe an anthropologist goes down and monitors, say, a tribe in South America. And they just kind of watch and measure some things about them, take notes, but they don't actually interact or change them. However, in the same idea, if they were to make that an experiment, maybe while they're watching them cook, they see that they're rubbing two sticks together to create a fire, and they introduce the idea of matches to the tribe. That would be applying a treatment and monitoring its effects. That actually becomes an experiment rather than an observational study. Now, of those two, experiments are very much better than observational study because experiments really rule out the idea of having results affected by some variable that's not actually part of the study. That is called a lurking variable. It's something that affects the other variables in the study, but it's actually not part of the study itself. And we're about to see an example of that. Okay, so here's two instances. One's an observational study, and one of them is an experiment. It's the same idea here. It's about ice cream and drownings. In the observational study, all they did was observe past data, and they concluded that ice cream causes drownings. And what did they base this on? they saw data that showed increases in ice cream sales are associated with the increase in drownings. What they didn't think about, though, is they missed the lurking variable of temperature. Because as temperature increases, well, ice cream sales increase, and so do drowning because more people are swimming. However, if they had performed an experiment instead, one group was given ice cream, another group did not get ice cream, sad group, and then they saw that the rate of drownings are the same in both groups. So ice cream consumption really had no effect on drownings. So the lurking variable was temperature, and it was lurking in the observational study, but it was not in the experiment affecting anything. Now let's look at some designs of experiments. We should have, in a design of experiments, we should have replication, randomization, and blinding. So we need to be able, with replication, have the number of subjects who received the treatment or the placebo. And we need to be able to do that over and over and over. We need to be able to replicate who's getting what. Blinding. This is where the subject doesn't know if they're getting the treatment or the placebo. And the placebo effect, and it does occur in experiments, is when a subject is given a placebo and they report an improvement. And that can happen quite often. A double-blind experiment is where the subject and the administrator do not know who's in what group. And randomization, as you can imagine, it's where you're going to assign your subjects to different groups through some kind of random selection. You could flip a coin. Or you could even draw names out of a hat. So we need to have replication, randomization, and blinding. We don't want to have any bias, and we want to have it as random as we possibly can in our experiment. Now let's look at some sampling methods. We have simple random sampling. So that's where we have a sample of n subjects that are selected. And they're selected in such a way that every sample of that size has the same chance of being selected. And that could be like pulling names out of a hat or a random number generator or something like that. A systematic sample is where you're going to select every kth subject. So I got a picture of you lining up the cars and you choose every third car. Maybe I call on every fifth kid in class, something like that. It's systematic, and that's not good if people can figure out the system. Convenience sample, that's when you use data that is easy to get. It's like I just asked my friends to answer a survey because, hey, they're really close and they're able to reach. It's easy for me. I don't really have to do a whole lot of work to go out and ask anybody anything. Convenience sample, using data that's easy to get. Another sampling method is a stratified sample. So we're going to break up the population into groups or strata. With similar characteristics. And then we're going to randomly sample from those strata. So let's say I put all the old people on one side of the room, all the young people on the other side of the room. And then I choose a few people from each group. The groups were the strata. I put based on age. And then I randomly chose people, just a few people from each group. Now that looks a lot like the next one, which is the cluster sample. We're still going to break up the population. And we're going to break them into groups or clusters. And then we are going to select some clusters randomly. And then select all the members of the cluster. So it's like neighborhoods or something like that. You could break it into neighborhoods. They don't have to be similar in characteristics, just break the population up into clusters. And then I pick a few neighborhoods and I take everybody out of that neighborhood. You could do that with classes. I could tell Mr. Rohn that I want to randomly select some classes. So I'm going to choose maybe my first period and Miss Valdez's third period and Miss Falls' fifth period. So I randomly chose some clusters, and then all of those students in that first, third, and fifth period that I just said are going to be the ones that I choose for the survey or experiment. Now, some sampling methods, continuing, is the multi-stage sampling. And this one is used by professional pollsters. And government researchers. And they combine basic sampling methods. So maybe they use cluster or systematic. All right, so let's review some of these sampling methods on the next slides. So I've got 5 examples here that we're going to go through. The name of each contestant is written on a separate card. The cards are placed in a bag, and 3 names are picked from the bag. So picked from a bag means random. A researcher interviews 19 work colleagues who work in his building. That's pretty convenient or lazy, so I'm going to go with convenience sample. An education researcher randomly selects 48 middle schools. So he's selecting the middle schools, and then he interviews all the teachers at each school. So that one is like selecting neighborhoods and getting everybody. That's a cluster. A market researcher selects 500 people from 10 cities. The 10 cities are like the strata, and he takes 500 people randomly from there, so that's going to be stratified. This one's easy. The tax auditor does every 1,000th income tax return. That's systematic. So make sure you can tell the difference between the different sampling methods. Okay, now we looked at experiments there for a moment. Let's look at observational studies. And there's 3 main ideas on these observational studies. In a cross-sectional study, data is observed, measured, and collected at one point in time, not over a time period. So that's, you could think of that as like the present. In a retrospective study, data is collected from a past period, like going back in time through examination of records and interviews. In a prospective or longitudinal or cohort study, data are collected in the future from groups that share common factors. And those groups are called cohorts. So we have present, past, and future observational studies. A present one would be kind of like I mentioned, that anthropologist goes down to South America, looks at the tribe, maybe observes a few things, measures, collects a little bit of data, and leaves. That's it. Now, a past or retrospective study is kind of like somebody's looking, we've been talking a lot about race in our country and slavery especially. So let's say somebody's examining some of those slave ship records. Those would be past records or interviews or any data from the past, collecting it and using it in an observational study to draw conclusions. Now, something future would be like all of you guys are graduating in 2021. So all of you seniors graduating, maybe we make you a group. We call you a cohort group. And in 10 years, we call and ask you, what have you been doing in the past 10 years? Did you get a 4-year degree at a college? Did you get the job that you were looking for? How much do you make? Maybe we kind of are interested in some of the data to see how successful our graduates are. So that would be collecting data in the future. In my example, 10 years in the future. Now, observational studies, remember those are where you're not actually doing anything to the subjects, but experiments, sometimes we can ruin those because of some kind of confounding that occurs in the experiment when your investigators are unable to distinguish among the effects of different factors. Maybe there's just no conclusion to be drawn right now because they just can't tell what's causing things. All right, so talking about experiments, we have 4 types of experimental design, and they kind of go along with our sampling methods. So our first one is a completely randomized experimental design. That's where we assign you randomly. So assign subjects through random sampling. Like pulling names out of a hat or flipping a coin. A randomized block design is where a block is a group of subjects that are similar. Gender or age. And you form blocks or groups of subjects with similar characteristics. And then you randomly assign treatments to the subjects within each block. And so that one looks a lot like our stratified approach on sampling. So we have a completely random where you assign your subjects randomly. We have a randomized block, which is where we get our block of subjects that are similar, and then we randomly sample them within each block. And then we have a matched pairs design. That's when we're able to compare 2 treatment groups that are related in some way. A common one is twins. Put one twin in one group, another twin in the other group, and compare them, or even before and after groups. And then, rarely, but it can happen, we use a rigorously controlled design, and that's where we carefully assign subjects to different groups. and so that and that we give the treatment in such a way that's important to the experiment. Okay, so I look at kind of what that one would be like. Let's say I have two groups of people that come in for a weight loss survey or experiment, and I want to give a weight loss drug to them. One group is the health nuts. They are exercising and watching their diet and doing that. And the other group is more like couch potatoes. They really, they'd like to lose weight, but they aren't going to do any extra effort. And so we have these groups of people, but I want to give them the drug. So I'm going to carefully assign them all the health nuts in one group and all the couch potatoes in another, and give them the treatment. But I'm going to watch how the treatment affects each group. And that's going to be important to my experiment. Or maybe I only want to give that to, say, the health nuts. And so I carefully choose that group of people. So I give them the treatment. Or maybe I only want to give it to the couch potatoes. I have to kind of look at how is that going to be important to my experiment. But so I know I'm allowing bias in my sampling, but I'm doing that to better my experiment. And we rarely use it, but it can be done. Now, you can't talk about sampling without talking about errors. And there are some errors that are not your fault, like when there's a discrepancy between a sample result and the true population result. And that such an error results from chance sample fluctuations. This one's not your fault at all. You didn't do anything wrong, just things happen. Now, a non-sampling error is definitely the result of human error. And it includes factors such as wrong data entry, computing errors, questions with biased wording, false data provided by your respondents, maybe you formed biased conclusions, maybe even applied statistical methods that are not appropriate. So human error, maybe you typed it in wrong. Maybe you made a computational error and maybe you added instead of times or something. Maybe you did questions that were biased or loaded questions. Maybe you had some false data, like maybe somebody decided not to tell you their true weight or height or something like that. Maybe they rounded down a lot. Forming biased conclusions. Maybe you were sponsored by the Dairy Farmers Association. So you boosted the data to really help the dairy farmers. Or maybe you just didn't even use the appropriate statistical method, which would be maybe you sat over there and tried to average Social Security numbers or something. Another one that is your fault is a non-random sample error. It's the result of using a sampling method that is definitely not random, such as a convenience or voluntary response sample. So if you're going to be lazy with your sampling, you're going to have bad data, and that's a sampling error.